Tonight, we continue our biography of the American continent. It's a very selective biography since our focus is on the qualities being of special importance for America's role in the coming spiritual age. We considered these qualities in our first two classes, grouped under four broad headings: the great energy of America in all its forms, the American character in its bright, positive aspects such as cheer, optimism, generosity, and tolerance, America's material mastery, the ability to understand and manipulate our resources with skill and ingenuity, and a deep love and longing for the truth, which includes the love of divinity in the beauty of nature, and spontaneous delight in and gratitude for the privilege of life. How might these qualities have been expressed before the arrival of Europeans on this continent? Can the distinctive blends of energy emanating from this continent be detected in the culture and life patterns of the native peoples? And did they leave a heritage or impressional history based on these qualities that might have influenced the formation of our own United States? Let's start with who the native peoples were and where they came from. At one time, these questions would have been easy to answer. Columbus, as we know, thought he had landed in or near India and called the natives Indians. When it became clear that the New World was not Asia, and that there was evidence that great cities and even whole civilizations had once existed here, the mystery seemed to deepen. A popular 16th century theory identified the Indians as descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, described in the Old Testament, who vanished in the 8th century BC after being exiled from the Holy Land by the invading Assyrians. The idea that the Indians might be the Hebrew lost tribes created a sensation in Europe, for it was felt that the rediscovery of the lost tribes and their conversion to Christianity would hasten the second coming of Christ. Elements of this belief are preserved today in the Book of Mormon, the Bible of the Mormon Church, which dates from the 19th century. It describes the journey of members of the lost tribes to America, how they established a civilization here, and how Jesus even visited them in America after the resurrection. Other theories abounded. If not the lost tribes, then the Indians must have descended from a migration of Carthaginians or Phoenicians, the great seafarers of the ancient world. Still others believe that a band of Vikings had passed through America, building the mysterious ceremonial mounds that dotted the Mississippi and Ohio Valley as they made their way to Mexico, where they became the Aztecs. As early as 1535, scholars were suggesting that the Indians might be refugees from the lost continent of Atlantis, mentioned by Plato in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias around 360 BC, or its Pacific counterpart, Lemuria. It seemed inconceivable that the sophisticated, ancient, pre-Columbian civilizations who left their decaying monumental buildings and exquisite artifacts made from jade, silver, turquoise, and gold had any relationship, any at all, to the apparently primitive native populations encountered by the European explorers and colonists when they first landed on these shores. Well, this attitude should not surprise us. You may recall that in the early Middle Ages, people thought the ruins of Rome had been built by an unknown race of giants, surely not the ancestors of the simple folk of the Italian countryside. The Aztecs thought the same about the culture that had preceded theirs, the builders of Teotihuacan, the ancient city of the gods in central Mexico. Nearly every colonial society has viewed the indigenous peoples it conquers in ways that reinforce their own superiority. We are most familiar with the examples of the European colonial empires in India, in Africa, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, as well as the Americas. But this widespread human trait is certainly not exclusive to Europeans. In the case of the American Indians, the situation has been hopelessly complicated by the fact that the moment the Europeans set foot on American soil, Indian culture was changed forever. For one thing, in less than a century, European diseases like smallpox had ravaged the continent, killing an estimated 90% of the Indian population. Though even that is a guess, because we have no way of knowing how large the population may have been. The survivors of these epidemics found themselves competing for increasingly scarce resources, competing not only with other tribes, but with a steadily growing influx of Europeans. Many tribes that had been peaceful for centuries now turned to warfare to preserve their homes and their food supply. In addition, prolonged contact with the Europeans led to far-reaching changes in the native way of life. As trade with the colonists increased, the Indians learned to adapt to European culture, and many tribes soon became dependent on it. European textiles, tools, and weapons replaced their own, and European methods supplanted traditional patterns of life. By the early 1700s, one Indian leader lamented that his people had forgotten how to make their own clothes and needed to buy them from the settlers. Even their diet changed with the introduction of European farm animals and agricultural practices. And in the West, the virtual extermination of the buffalo. In addition, as European and later American settlement expanded, Indians were removed from their ancestral homes and forced to adapt to environments that were totally alien to the way of life they had known for centuries. People from the mountains were relocated to the prairies and the deserts. That they were able to survive is a tribute to their resourcefulness and their innate understanding of how to live in harmony with the land. The forces of settlement and colonization were so disruptive to the ancient life patterns that an Indian of 1600 would barely recognize his descendants in 1850. The anthropologists who visited such people and wrote about their culture had little or no idea how much they had changed. In the words of a modern writer, it was as if they had encountered the survivors of a concentration camp and assumed the inhabitants had always been barefoot and starving. Still another barrier to understanding the native peoples includes the fact that the American Indians had no written tradition. Our historical knowledge of their cultures and beliefs is based largely on the accounts of European observers who rarely held an objective or impartial view of their subject. Today, I doubt that anyone's view can be uncolored by sentiment. We have grown up with cultural stereotypes of the Indian, both positive and negative, all around us. Even in supposedly neutral academic disciplines such as history and cultural anthropology, scholarly work too has tended to be subtly, even unconsciously biased, most recently toward what may be an overly sympathetic view in an effort to compensate for the decades of scholarly prejudice and indifference. Given their experience, the Indians themselves have been reluctant to share anything of their culture with white researchers and sometimes even misled them about their traditions and beliefs. In recent decades, Indians have become more active in preserving their own cultural histories. The work of the new National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. is a good example. And yet, even they have found it difficult to reconstruct a reliable record of their oral traditions beyond a few generations. As a result, just about everything that is written or said about the original pre-contact cultures is essentially guesswork. Very little is actually known. Given all these difficulties, what can we know about the First Nations? Who were they? Where did they come from? And how did they live? According to DNA studies, 95% of today's native populations in North, Central, and South America belong to 4 genetic lineages associated with Northern Asia. It is believed that nomadic hunters, originally from Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China, first found their way to the New World during the last ice age. At that time, so much water had been locked up in the glaciers that the oceans were nearly 300 feet lower than they are today. The Bering Strait, a 55-mile wide stretch of open water that separates Alaska from Siberia, would then have been dry land. Geologists have named this region Beringia, and they have found evidence indicating that during certain periods, Beringia was an almost temperate, grassy plain where summer temperatures could reach 50 degrees, a welcoming habitat for animals of the time. But below it, two great ice sheets covered eastern and western Canada, blocking passage to the rest of the continent for thousands of years. From time to time, however, the last time being about 14,000 years ago, a warming period would have melted the edges of the two ice sheets, creating an ice-free corridor through the Yukon River Valley and east of the Canadian Rockies, right down to America. However, the melting ice would eventually raise the sea level again, submerging Beringia and cutting off the land bridge from Siberia, until the next cycle of cooling lowered the sea level once again. So for several brief periods during the Ice Age, a window was opened for people from Siberia to migrate overland all the way down to North America, probably following the animals. They may also have come by sea, following the coast to the Pacific Northwest and California. Stone Age tools have been found all over America that have been reliably dated back to the end of the Ice Age, roughly 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. This time period also coincides with the mass extinction of the megafauna, the large mammals such as mammoths and saber-toothed cats, as well as the North American horse. Scientists have long debated the role of the first Americans in this mass extinction, since spear points and mammoth bones have been found together at several ancient campsites. For 3/4 of a century, this has been our best understanding of the evidence. And yet, as with every scientific field we have encountered in this series, physics, astronomy, geology, new discoveries are causing archaeologists and anthropologists to rethink many of their basic assumptions. Let me quickly summarize some recent findings. Excavations in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and as far away as Chile have pushed back the confirmed evidence of human settlement of the Americas by many, many thousands of years. The DNA evidence can be read to indicate that the Asian and North American strains of human genetic matter may have diverged not 13,000, but as early as 33,000 years ago. And a fifth DNA lineage has been found, shared by a small group of modern Indians in Canada, which is not native to Asia, but can be found in Europe, though it may have passed through Asia on its way here. Then there is the puzzling skeletal evidence. In Europe, there is a wealth of Stone Age skeletal remains which date back more than 30,000 years. In America, there are very few, and none appear to be more than 11,000 years old. When closely examined, these skeletal remains resemble not Siberians or even modern Indians, but Polynesians. Here, for example, is a restoration of one of them found in Washington State. Linguists have joined the fray. They note that there is no part of the world with as many different languages as the Americas. According to the anthropologist Edward Sapir, in the state of California alone, there are greater and more numerous linguistic extremes than can be illustrated in all the length and breadth of Europe. Some specialists maintain that it would take at least 30,000 years for that degree of diversity to develop on this continent, and one expert at Berkeley proposed that the First Nations may have originated in South America and traveled gradually north. We will not solve these puzzles in this series. However, we can say that whoever arrived here first left very little behind. Clear evidence of human adaptation to the land emerges only at the end of the Ice Age, about 13,500 years ago. The historical record of the First Nations really begins there, and it begins with a very unusual kind of spear point. In the 1920s and 1930s, archaeological sites in Arizona and Mexico began to find prehistoric stone tools mixed in with the bones of mammoths and other prehistoric animals. This was the first tangible evidence of an early human presence in America. The tools included scraping and carving implements similar to Stone Age tools that had been found in Asia and Europe, though the European tools were thousands of years older. However, one distinctive style of stone spear point was unique to North America. It became known as the Clovis point, after the town in New Mexico where it was first discovered, and the people who fashioned it became known as the Clovis people, or the Clovis culture, the earliest recognizable human culture in North America. The Clovis point was a multi-purpose tool, a major technological breakthrough of its time. 4 to 6 inches long, it was sharp enough and strong enough to penetrate the hide of a mammoth. Unlike earlier spear points, it was shaped on both sides, bifaced, giving it a sharp, serrated edge that could be used as a knife for cutting, trimming, and scraping, and it was fluted, that is, it was grooved to fit into a notched wooden spear. If the tip broke off during use, there was enough stone left to fashion a new one, so it was, in essence, reusable. Unlike earlier crude stone tools, the Clovis point was expertly crafted from the best materials, carefully selected, fine-grained stone that often came from sites hundreds of miles away from where the points have been found. Volcanic obsidian from Yellowstone, agate from Utah, translucent quartz chalcedony from North Dakota and Ohio, brilliantly colored dolomite from Texas. These materials may well have been selected for their beauty and translucency as well as their durability, perhaps even, as one researcher suggests, because the people thought that the beautiful weaponry was thought pleasing to the hunter's prey. The Clovis people evidently knew the land and its resources very, very well. Many of their quarrying sites are still recognized as the best sources for high-quality stone and have been sought out and used by generations of Indian craftsmen. Clovis points have been found in every one of the 48 continental states, parts of Canada, and as far south as Costa Rica. And they have been found nowhere else on Earth. By the 1960s, carbon dating methods had determined that the Clovis culture flourished about 13,500 years ago, making the Clovis point the earliest example of American material mastery, a perfect combination of beauty and utility. Researchers are amazed at how this new technology spread so rapidly across the entire continent. Did a single tribe of Clovis people settle everywhere, or were the points traded far and wide by many independent groups whom the Clovis people linked together? Well, no one really knows. Since Clovis spear points were found among mammoth bones at several sites, these earliest inhabitants were often pictured in negative terms as ruthless, prehistoric big game hunters whose efficient methods of slaughter may have been responsible for the extinction of the mammoths and other megafauna in North America. However, more recent findings paint a different picture. For example, excavations since 1998 in central Texas indicate that the Clovis people there had a complex way of life that effectively used all the resources of the land, including native plants, animals from turtles and alligators to foxes and opossums, along with the occasional mammoth. In other words, they developed generalized patterns of hunting and gathering that were very similar to the lifestyles native peoples followed thousands of years later. After pioneering and preparing the way for later native peoples, the Clovis culture disappeared from the record. It lasted only 500 years, a brief moment compared to the more well-known civilizations. However, in those 500 years, they lived through what may have been the most tumultuous period of change in human history, the end of a 60,000-year glacial epoch and the beginning of the modern age. They witnessed the torrential floods that carved out the Great Lakes, the Mississippi Valley, and the Chesapeake Bay. They watched the oceans rise, inundating the coast up to 60 miles inland. They saw the forests become prairies, and prairies become deserts as the climate warmed, and they would have seen the plants and animals they had come to depend on slowly die off. Yet, somehow these people adapted to season after season of catastrophic change. They were able to survive and to teach others to survive, and they shared their growing knowledge of the land, their highly skilled craftsmanship, and their obvious love of beauty across the entire continent. It was their descendants who became the guardians of this land for the next 10,000 years, the American Indians. The Clovis phase is the only period before our own time when a single unified culture was thought to span the entire continent. One archaeologist has made a very tentative guess that the Clovis population at its peak may have reached about 100,000. To put that in perspective, try to imagine any state, say the state of California or New York or Maryland, or even a small state like Rhode Island with no more than 2,000 people living in the entire state. And that would be a high estimate. However, by the time of European contact, some 12,000 years later, the population north of the Rio Grande is estimated to be in the millions, perhaps as high as 18 million, with even larger populations in Mexico and further south. As the population increased since Clovis times, the early Indians learned to adapt to many diverse and distinct environments. In time, they developed regionally distinctive patterns of life. Presumably, families became clans. Clans formed tribes, and tribes gradually grew into nations. And the differences in climate, activity, and diet gradually led to the physical differentiation among native peoples we see today. By the time of Columbus, there were an estimated 500 separate Indian nations in what would become the United States. They spoke hundreds of different languages and dialects and had widely varied forms of social organization. Some were nomadic hunters, others lived in settled villages. Still others were cliff dwellers. Some were warlike. Most were peaceful. Many were matrilineal societies where clan mothers held great influence. To study them all, anthropologists have divided the continent into 10 to 12 broad, geographically based culture areas, such as the eastern woodlands, the Great Plains, the Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest. California, with at least 100 different tribal subgroups, has an entire culture area to itself. This remarkable diversity of cultures flowed from the energies of the land itself. For as we have seen, divinity has designed this continent to nurture and amplify many distinctive and different patterns of growth. One would have to combine all the cultures of Europe and Asia to approach the level of diversity found among the Indians of the Americas. These native people did not develop along European or Asian lines, either materially or spiritually. Consider first their material culture. In the Old World, the Stone Age gave way to the Bronze Age as metals were mastered and used to fashion more durable tools, vehicles, armor, and of course, weapons. But in the Americas, bronze was unknown. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, two metals not generally found together on this continent. So the Indians never discovered how to make it. Instead, they learned to work copper and other precious metals such as gold and silver, primarily to fashion finely crafted decorative ornaments. Though they achieved an extraordinary level of craftsmanship in the materials they did use, and were capable of remarkable feats of engineering, from the standpoint of archaeological classification based on their technology, they essentially remained in the Stone Age for 11,000 years. Even the wheel was unknown to them. Actually, that's not precisely true. Small animal figurines mounted on clay wheels have been found in southern Mexico. They may have been toys. One cannot imagine the civilizations of Europe or Asia, or indeed our own, without the wheel, whether it is used for transport or as part of a mechanism: potter's wheels, water wheels, millstone wheels, pulleys. Yet there is no sign of its use in the Americas beyond these little toys. Scholars offer a possible explanation by noting another important difference between the Old World and the New: the absence of large domesticated animals. Before the Europeans came, the Indians had no horses, no donkeys, no cattle or oxen that might be used to pull a cart. One couldn't very well use an antelope or a buffalo. The only domesticated animal in pre-Columbian North America was the dog, hardly a beast of burden. Historians also point out that a wheeled cart might not have been practical in the kinds of rough, steep, wooded, or marshy terrain found in many regions where Indians settled. In other words, they may have tried it centuries ago and found they could move faster on foot. Anthropologists don't really know. Another great difference is writing. A written language, a way to preserve and circulate information and knowledge, is generally considered an essential step in the development of civilization. It is hard to imagine an old world civilization without a writing system of some kind, whether it be Egyptian hieroglyphs, Chinese pictograms, Sumerian clay tablets, or Sanskrit scrolls. Dozens of ancient written languages emerged in the Old World beginning about 5,000 years ago. Yet, of the hundreds of Indian nations existing for thousands of years in the Americas, only the Maya and a few related cultures in southern Mexico developed a written language. Well, let's see. We don't have bronze, iron, or steel. We don't have the wheel. We don't have writing. We don't have large domestic animals. What else is missing? Well, more fundamental than any of these is agriculture. The transition from foraging to farming is generally regarded as the first step toward civilization. In this round of time, civilization began with the cultivation of cereal grains, such as wheat, rye, barley, and rice. As with so much about prehistory, the origin of agriculture is the subject of vigorous debate. So far, the earliest well-documented examples come from the Middle East, about 11,000 years ago, as the Ice Age was ending and the world was entering a warmer, wetter phase when plants can thrive. Farming quickly spread from this cradle eastward to Mesopotamia, Central Asia, India and China, and west to Turkey, Greece, and Italy, and what we think of as civilization soon followed. Wheat, rye, barley, and rice. None of these essential crops were native to North America. There were no fields of wild grain here to discover and cultivate. Our native peoples continued as hunter-gatherers for thousands of years after agriculture developed in the Old World. In terms of material development, it seems as though divinity had stacked the deck against the American Indian. Then, about 7,000 years ago, the Indians did something miraculous that changed everything. Something that Western science was not able to achieve until our own time. Somehow, and botanists would very much like to know how, they transformed a wild mountain grass with almost no nutritional value into what is today the leading food crop in the world: corn. It is impossible to overstate the importance of corn to the life of the Americas. Indian civilizations from Mexico to the Mississippi depended on it. And without it, the Pilgrims would not have survived their first winter to establish a colony at Plymouth. Wherever corn was grown, the native peoples have associated it with divinity. Many tribes tell the story of a divine figure called the corn mother who appears in the form of an old woman, or the corn maiden who appears as a beautiful young woman who brings the tribe the precious gift of corn. As a decorative motif, the image of the corn plant is used in dozens of ways. It's a symbol of life, of blessings, of power and of energy. The Aztecs believed that corn contained the sacred energy of the sun, the basic energy of life essential for man's physical and spiritual well-being. In the Mayan cosmology, the corn plant is sometimes pictured as the axis of the universe. And corn is central in the Maya story of the creation of man. In one version, the divine figure of the winged serpent, whom the Aztecs called Quetzalcoatl, first tried to create men from mud or clay, but they dissolved when they got wet. Next, he tried to make men from wood. Well, they could build houses, but they had no mind or heart. Finally, he created humanity out of cornmeal, which proved to be the ideal substance. Even today, descendants of the Indians in southern Mexico refer to themselves idiomatically as hombres de maíz, men of maize. Maize is simply the word for corn in the language of the Indians who first met Columbus. The phrase men of maize may be a way of rendering the original Aztec word for human beings, which literally means maize people. The Aztec word for maize dough translates as our flesh. Considering the many uses of corn in the Mexican diet and our own, this phrase may be much truer than one might think. Did you know that maize is an entirely man-made plant? It does not exist in nature, and corn cannot reproduce itself if left on its own. The individual kernels, which are the seeds, are firmly attached to the cob and wrapped up tight in the protective husk of the corn ear. For new plants to grow, someone has to open the husk, cut the kernels from the cob, and plant them in the ground. When a plant cannot reproduce without human intervention, botanists say it is domesticated. As it turns out, the origin of agriculture all around the world is closely associated with the emergence of domesticated plants. How did it happen? In their wild forms, the seeds of most cereal grains develop at the top of the plant, and the seed head or ear is very brittle. When the individual plant ripens, the head breaks apart to scatter the seeds on the ground. That ensures survival for the next generation of plants. But it makes a lot more work for human beings trying to harvest the grain. As each plant matures on its own timetable, the resulting crop ripens at different times rather than all at once. However, a fairly common mutation of just one gene will change most grain plants so that the head does not break apart. In these mutated plants, the grain waits on the stem to be harvested by hand. Seeds are easy to collect, and the farmer can replant them by hand to cultivate more plants with that genetic variation. Early farmers noticed this and also noticed that all plants planted in this way at the same time would germinate at the same time, making for a much more efficient harvest. As geneticists say, they then selected for those traits by reseeding more and more of the mutated strain, and within a few seasons established the mutation permanently as a new domesticated variety, one that was many times more productive than its wild cousins. The first mutated seeds could then be passed along by travelers going to Europe or Asia from the Middle East, and so in this way, agriculture spread widely east and west. Did corn develop that way in America? Well, not exactly. Researchers have called corn the most controversial and enigmatic of all cultivated plants because its origins and development are so puzzling. Genetic evidence indicates that corn evolved from a wild grass of the Mexican highlands that bears almost no resemblance to its modern descendant. The little seed head of this wild grass is only 2 to 3 inches long, holding 5 to 12 hard, woody kernels, each one seated in its own casing. Like other wild grasses, the heads break apart at maturity to scatter their seeds on the ground. You'll recall that in most grains, the ability to shatter is controlled by a single gene. However, in this grass, there are at least 16 different genes involved. To get them all to mutate together is, as one writer described it, a situation so complex that geneticists have effectively thrown up their hands after trying to explain how a non-shattering type might have appeared spontaneously. Remember, domesticated wheat and barley were achieved by collecting naturally mutated plants that didn't shatter and selectively planting them instead of the wild form of the grain. But here, with so many genes involved, the odds are overwhelmingly against the mutation ever occurring in nature. If they had no mutated plants to start with, how could the Indians have created them? Botanists say that anyone who could achieve such a thing today would win a Nobel Prize. But the Indians did it in 7,000 years ago. And they did much more. In the spring of 2005, a research team sponsored by the National Science Foundation completed a genetic analysis and comparison of the original wild grass and modern corn to identify all the genes responsible for domestication. They found that the Indians had selectively targeted and altered 1,200 different genes. By modifying these genes, they stop the stalk from branching so it would produce fewer but larger ears. They turned the seed head into a cob, eliminated the hard casing around the individual kernels, and developed the protective husk around the entire ear. They quintupled the size of the ear, doubled and redoubled the number of rows of kernels per cob, increased the size of the kernels, made them softer, and multiplied the number of kernels 100-fold. Tiny cobs of ancient corn have been found in caves in the Mexican highlands, showing the transition from its early stages. It may have taken more than 1,000 years. One wonders, what inspired them to do it in the first place? And what made them continue, slowly and steadily, to continue on over so many centuries? Though researchers continue to puzzle over these questions, the simplest explanation may come from the Indians' own stories. They tell us in many different ways that corn was a gift from God. I have reviewed this information in some detail because it is such a clear illustration of several of our American qualities at work. Is this material mastery? I should say so, and at the genetic level. What about the qualities of character needed to attempt such a bold, ingenious enterprise and to see it through over so many centuries? We can also see, flowing from the land itself, the basic energy for growth and transformation that typifies this continent, inspiring and sustaining the work, and ultimately expressing itself in every kernel of corn.